That night changed everything. I didn't know it then, but nothing would ever be the same again. I could hear the soft creak of the floorboards outside my door, my heart pounding faster with every step. It was him. I didn't have to see him to know. His presence was always undeniable, even in the stillness of the night. We had shared countless nights like this, no word spoken, just the comforting silence that came with knowing someone was close. But this night felt different. Something in the air was heavy, charged, as if the very atmosphere between us had shifted. The dim light from my desk lamp barely illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the walls. My thoughts were racing, but it was like I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. My chest felt tight, my mind swirling with confusion and desire. Was I imagining things? Or was something real about to happen? I stared at the door, half expecting him to walk in, as if he could somehow read my thoughts. The tension in my body was unbearable. Was I ready to face whatever this was, whatever had started to form between us? Or had I been living in denial all along? He was my cousin, and we'd known each other our whole lives. There had never been any secrets between us. At least, that's what I thought. But recently, things between us had started to feel different, like there was an invisible thread pulling us closer, one that neither of us could ignore anymore. Our conversations were different now, those lingering glances, the accidental touches. We'd always been close, but the line between friendship and something else had become blurred. I could feel the heat of his gaze even when he wasn't looking directly at me. And I wondered, did he feel it too? Or was I simply imagining this shift? But what did this mean? If I acted on these feelings, things could never go back to how they were. Would we lose everything, our family bond, our trust in each other, or could there be something more? I wasn't ready for this. But then again, whoever is. The uncertainty weighed heavily on me, but there was also a part of me that wanted to know the truth, to face this strange and unexpected connection. Maybe I could bury it. Maybe I could pretend it wasn't there, but I already knew the truth. Ignoring it would only make it worse. I needed to confront whatever this was, even if it scared me more than anything I had ever faced before. I had no idea that just one conversation, one touch, could change everything. But tonight, I could feel it in my bones. Something was going to happen. Something I couldn't stop, even if I tried. And as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it. The moment that would define everything. We'd always been close, perhaps closer than cousins should be. Growing up together, our bond had never really fit the conventional mold. People often saw us as inseparable, always laughing, always sharing, always supporting each other. It had always been that way, or at least, that's how I convinced myself. Our families lived next door to each other, so we spent nearly every day together, from childhood games to late-night talks. And those talks, those long whispered conversations, were the things that defined our relationship. It wasn't just family that brought us together. It was our shared experiences, our similar way of thinking, the way we understood each other without needing to speak. I remember the first time I realized how different our relationship was from the others. We were teenagers then, but it wasn't an obvious moment. It was the quiet, small moments that stuck with me, the way his laughter would ring out in the kitchen while we made breakfast together, how we would lie side by side in the grass during summer afternoons, just watching the clouds pass by. I found myself leaning on him in ways I didn't lean on anyone else. I began to see how little I needed to say for him to know exactly how I was feeling. The silence between us had a language of its own. The unspoken connection was comfortable, natural, and something neither of us questioned for years. It felt safe. When things were tough, when life felt too complicated, he was always there, and I was there for him. But lately, those small, seemingly insignificant moments were starting to change. Our conversations weren't the same. I could feel the subtle shift in our dynamic, the way our shared jokes seemed to linger in the air longer than before, like something unspoken was between us. I caught myself thinking about him in ways I shouldn't have. It wasn't just his smile anymore, or the warmth of his voice. There was something else, something unnameable that stirred inside me every time we were close. And I knew deep down it was wrong. We had a tradition, something I looked forward to every week, where we would stay up late watching movies in his room. We would eat junk food, laugh at bad horror movies, and talk about everything, our dreams, our fears, our plans for the future. But lately the atmosphere had changed. There were more silences, moments where I caught myself looking at him too long, wondering if he noticed the subtle shift in my gaze. I didn't know if it was in my head, or if he felt it too. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a phase, just the familiarity of being together too long. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something there, something deeper than either of us were willing to admit. The tension between us wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, lingering in the background like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I started noticing how his touch lingered just a second longer when passing me something, or how his eyes would meet mine, searching them for something, but quickly looking away when I caught him. It was subtle, but it was there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was feeling it too. I began to question if I was the only one who felt this way. If I could feel this connection, could he? Was he just as confused, just as lost in the shifting current between us? We had never really talked about it, not directly. Talking about emotions wasn't something either of us was good at. We'd always communicated with ease, but it was never about anything deep, anything personal. It was all surface-level stuff, school, family, friends. But these recent changes between us couldn't stay buried forever. We couldn't keep pretending that everything was just the same. There were things unsaid, things I couldn't stop thinking about, and I began to wonder if he was in the same position. One evening, we were sitting in the living room, watching a movie, like we always did. But that night, everything felt different. His leg brushed against mine as he shifted on the couch, and I felt an electric spark shoot through me. It wasn't the kind of accidental touch we had shared 1,000 times before. This time it lingered, and so did the moment that followed. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, catching a glimpse of his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were softer than I remembered. I could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air between us, heavy and unyielding. It wasn't just the physical touch, it was something more. Something in his voice, the way he said my name a little differently, softer. I didn't want to acknowledge it at first. I couldn't. I didn't want to be the one to bring it up. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend that I wasn't aware of the way he looked at me sometimes, or how I couldn't stop thinking about him in a way that was completely new, completely unsettling. I had always trusted him, always felt safe around him, but now everything felt like it was on the brink of changing. Maybe he felt it too. Maybe this was just a phase we'd grow out of. But in that moment, with his gaze locked on mine and the weight of everything we weren't saying hanging in the air, I knew something had changed. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it became impossible to pretend it wasn't there. What had started as innocent gestures, just two cousins who had been raised together, was now something far more complicated. Something that neither of us were prepared for. And so, the questions lingered. What would happen if we spoke up? What would happen if we acknowledged what was between us? Could we keep pretending that nothing had changed, or would it come to light in ways neither of us could control? All I knew was that something had shifted, and nothing was going to be the same again. The change in our relationship was subtle at first, but over time, it became undeniable. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the way we interacted, but one that seemed to hang in the air whenever we were near each other. I could feel it, and I wondered if he felt it too. The space between us was no longer just physical, it was emotional, charged with something unspoken. Something we both sensed but neither of us was brave enough to address. We had always been close, even as kids. We had grown up together, shared experiences that shaped us into the people we were today. But as we entered adulthood, the boundaries between us began to blur. Our conversations had always flowed easily, but now, it felt like there were more pauses, more hesitation between us. I found myself reading his expressions more carefully, analyzing his every word, wondering if he was thinking the same thing I was. It wasn't like anything had changed on the surface. We still spent time together, shared jokes, and laughed as we always had. But now, there was something more, something deeper lurking beneath the surface. I noticed the way his gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual, the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. There was an intimacy in his touch that hadn't been there before. Small things that I had once brushed off, now felt laden with meaning. One evening, we were sitting together on the couch, watching TV. It was a normal night, nothing out of the ordinary, but I couldn't help but notice the way his shoulder brushed against mine as we both reached for the remote. It was just a brief contact, but it lingered longer than it should have. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I tried to dismiss it as nothing, but deep down, I knew it was more. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It was in the way he looked at me when we spoke. His eyes, once casual, now seemed to hold more depth, more meaning. I would catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It wasn't the usual glance, the one that was easily ignored. This time, it was different. His eyes seemed to search mine, as if trying to find something, or perhaps something he had been too afraid to confront. There was a certain tension that filled the air when we were together. It wasn't spoken, but it was there, thick and palpable. When we were alone, everything seemed amplified. Every glance, every word, every touch seemed to carry more weight. I wondered if he could feel it too, or if it was just me, overthinking everything. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. I started to analyze every moment we shared, looking for signs, for confirmation of what I was feeling. It wasn't just his physical proximity that was affecting me, it was the emotional pull that I couldn't explain. When he smiled at me, it felt different, sweeter, warmer, more intimate. When he laughed, it wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration in my chest, something that resonated deep within me. The moments when we were together, when our hands brushed or when we laughed together, felt like small, fleeting glimpses of something more. But there was also an underlying tension, a fear of what was happening. We had never crossed any lines before. Our relationship had always been straightforward, uncomplicated. But now, every word and every action seemed to be laden with meaning. It was like we were walking a fine line, and every step we took felt like it could tip us over into something we weren't ready for. I couldn't help but wonder if he felt the same way, or if I was simply imagining it all. The more time we spent together, the more I began to notice how different our interactions had become. It wasn't just in the way we looked at each other or the way our hands accidentally brushed against each other. It was in the silence between us. There were moments when we would be together, and the world would fade away. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy. We didn't need to speak, we just existed together in a way that felt different from anything we had experienced before. But the most confusing part of it all was how easily we fell back into old patterns. We would still laugh at the same jokes, talk about the same things, and share the same experiences that we always had. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But underneath, there was a constant hum of something unsaid, something unacknowledged. It was like walking through a fog, where everything felt familiar, but you couldn't quite make out the details. One evening, we found ourselves sitting on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around us as we sipped our drinks in comfortable silence. It was one of those moments that had always felt natural between us, but this time, there was a weight to it. I didn't want to break the silence, didn't want to ruin whatever fragile peace we had between us. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt the urge to say something, to break the tension that was hanging between us. I glanced over at him, noticing the way his profile was illuminated by the soft light from the porch lamp. He looked so calm, so collected, as if nothing had changed. But I could see the subtle tension in his posture, the way his fingers clenched around his drink. It was as if he was holding something back, something he didn't know how to say. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was scared of the answer, scared of what would happen if I pushed too hard. In those moments of silence, I began to question everything. Was it just me? Was I reading too much into things? Or was there something there, something we both knew but weren't ready to admit? I wanted to know, needed to know, but I was afraid of what it might mean. We were standing at the edge of something, and I didn't know how to take the next step. Would I lose him if I confronted what was happening? Would we still be able to go back to the way things were? The shift in our dynamic had become too strong to ignore. Every look, every touch, every silence between us carried more weight than it had before. We were in uncharted territory, and neither of us knew how to navigate it. I could feel myself pulling away, trying to protect myself from the uncertainty, but I also couldn't help but feel drawn to him, pulled by an invisible force that I couldn't explain. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I needed to say, but I didn't know how. Would he understand? Would he feel the same way? The questions swirled in my mind, but I couldn't find the answers. All I knew was that something had changed, and I couldn't go back to the way things were before. We were standing on the brink of something, and I wasn't sure whether to take the plunge or pull back. The tension between us had reached its peak, and I knew that something was going to have to give. The emotional tension between us had reached a breaking point, and I knew it couldn't go on forever. I had tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that everything was fine, but the weight of our unspoken feelings had become too much to bear. It wasn't just the lingering looks or the awkward silences, it was something deeper. Something raw. It happened one night when we were sitting on the couch, the hum of the city barely audible in the background. We had been talking for hours as we often did, but tonight was different. The usual lightheartedness between us felt strained. There was something heavy in the air, and neither of us could pretend it wasn't there. The silence between us was almost deafening, as though everything we hadn't said was shouting at us, demanding to be heard. I could feel the tension building in my chest. My hands were clammy, my heart racing. I glanced over at him, and for a moment, our eyes locked. I didn't know what it was, but something shifted in that moment. It was as if time stopped for a second, and everything else faded away. His expression was unreadable, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He knew. He could feel it too. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat. I wasn't sure what to say. How could I put into words the way I had been feeling? How could I explain what had been happening between us without ruining everything? But before I could say anything, he spoke. Why are we pretending? His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. There was a vulnerability in his tone, a rawness that I wasn't used to. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened as he waited for me to respond. We can't keep going on like this. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. I had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I had always thought I would be the one to say something first, but now that he had brought it up, I was terrified. Terrified of what it would mean, terrified of how it would change everything. I don't know what you mean, I said, my voice sounding weaker than I had intended. I knew I was lying, but I couldn't help myself. Part of me still wanted to deny what was happening, to pretend that everything was fine. But I could see the disappointment flash across his face. He wasn't buying it. You do, he replied, his voice steady but laced with emotion. You feel it too. I can see it in the way you look at me, the way you act around me. We can't keep pretending like we don't know what's going on. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I had no words, no answers to give him. I had spent so long avoiding the truth, but now, in the face of his honesty, I couldn't escape it any longer. He stood up then, pacing the room, the energy between us crackling like static. I can't keep pretending, he said again, his voice rising with emotion. It's too much. I don't want to keep feeling this way. I need to know if you feel it too. Because if you don't, I need to know. The vulnerability in his voice was raw, and for the first time, I saw him as more than just the person I had known for so long. He wasn't just my friend anymore. He was someone who was hurting, someone who needed answers, just as much as I did. I couldn't look away from him, even as the fear and uncertainty threatened to overwhelm me. I do feel it, I whispered, the words slipping out before I even had time to think about them. It was like a weight had been lifted off my chest, but now there was only more weight to carry. I had admitted it, but what did it mean? What would happen now? He froze, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. We stood there, two people caught in the silence of our own admissions. I could hear the sound of my own breath, shallow and uneven, and I knew he could hear it too. The realization of what we were saying, of what we were admitting to each other, was overwhelming. I thought you might, he said softly, his voice a mixture of relief and fear. I've been waiting for you to say it. I didn't know if you would, or if you felt the same way. But now that you've said it, I don't know what to do with it. There it was, the admission, the confession that had been hanging between us for so long. It was both terrifying and freeing at the same time. I could feel my chest tightening as the reality of it all began to set in. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. I don't know either, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But I can't ignore it anymore. I can't pretend that nothing's changed. We were standing at the edge of something neither of us was ready to face, but something we could no longer avoid. Our relationship, everything we had known, had been shaken to its core. And in that moment, I realized just how fragile everything really was. But as I looked at him, the confusion and fear slowly giving way to something else, something more tender, I knew that we couldn't turn back. The fear of what might happen was overwhelming, but the pull between us was stronger. We were both standing on the edge of the unknown, and there was no easy way to navigate the path ahead. What happens now? I asked, my voice shaking with uncertainty. I don't know, he replied, his eyes never leaving mine. But I can't pretend I don't want to find out. The air between us was thick with emotion. It wasn't just tension anymore, it was raw, vulnerable, unfiltered. I could see it in his eyes, the longing, the fear, the hope. And I realized then that I felt the same way. Whatever this was, whatever it had become, it was real. We couldn't deny it anymore. And so, in the quiet of that moment, amidst the uncertainty and fear, we both knew that something had irrevocably changed. The tension had finally been addressed, but what would come next was still a mystery. Would we be able to navigate this new path together, or would we find ourselves lost along the way? The truth was, neither of us knew. But one thing was certain, we couldn't go back to the way things were before. The room felt quieter now, even though the world outside still hummed with the usual noise. The air was different, thicker somehow, yet lighter at the same time. We had both said what needed to be said, but there was still so much unspoken between us. My mind raced, wondering if this moment would be the beginning of something new or if it would crumble beneath the weight of uncertainty. But no matter how much I tried to predict what would happen next, I couldn't. And maybe that was the hardest part. The tension between us had shifted from something suffocating to something raw and uncertain. There was no clear path ahead, no simple answer to how we could move forward. But one thing had changed irrevocably, the truth was out in the open. There were no more secrets between us, no more pretending. And in a strange way, that felt like freedom. I glanced over at him. He was sitting at the edge of the couch, his posture slightly tense, but his eyes were softer now. I could see the relief in his expression, just the smallest hint that he wasn't alone in his feelings anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to hold on to for now. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It wasn't the silence of avoidance or confusion, it was the silence of two people just being. No words were necessary. The unspoken bond that had always been there now had a name, a shape. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice breaking through my thoughts. It was a simple question, but one that seemed so loaded with meaning. And, for the first time, I realized I didn't have an immediate answer. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice faltering slightly. "I don't think I regret it. But I don't know what it means yet. I don't know what we do with it now." His lips quirked into a half-smile, as though he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe we both did. I guess that's the thing, isn't it? We don't have to have all the answers right away. I exhaled slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. For so long, we had been focused on defining what this, whatever this was, meant. We had tried to put a label on it, to figure out exactly what it meant for us and our future. But maybe we didn't have to know all the answers now. Maybe we could just let things unfold, without rushing to figure everything out in one moment. I glanced at him again, my gaze softer this time. There was a sense of calm in him now, a quiet acceptance that hadn't been there before. He seemed at peace with the uncertainty, something I couldn't quite claim for myself yet. But I was getting there. "We don't have to figure it all out," I said finally. "Not right now. Maybe we just need to see where this goes." He nodded, his eyes meeting mine with something that felt like trust. It wasn't the kind of trust that came from knowing everything about someone, from having all the answers. It was the trust that came from vulnerability. From taking a step forward without knowing where the path would lead. "Yeah," he agreed softly, his voice carrying a weight that matched my own uncertainty. "Maybe we just need to let it be." There was a comfort in that. The idea that we didn't have to rush, that we didn't need to decide everything right then. That we could just exist in the present, in the space between us, and let things unfold as they would. It was strange to feel this way, to be standing at the edge of something and not know if we were falling or if we were standing still. But for once, I wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. There was something in his presence that made me feel like I wasn't alone, like whatever came next, we would figure it out together. The evening stretched on, and the room felt a little warmer now. We didn't talk much after that. There was no need. The words had been said, and now all we had was the quiet understanding between us, the subtle connection that had always been there, just waiting to be acknowledged. And yet, as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. I had no idea what our future would look like, whether we would end up as more than friends, whether the distance between us would grow, or whether our bond would evolve into something completely different. What I did know, however, was that we had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. Whatever happened from here on out, we would be different. And in some way, that felt like a promise. A promise that we had finally acknowledged something true and real between us. As I lay in bed that night, the darkness of the room enveloping me, I realized that the uncertainty of the situation no longer felt like a burden. It felt like possibility. For the first time, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders, knowing that we weren't bound by expectations or definitions. We had the space to breathe, to figure things out without rushing. And maybe that was enough. For now, it was enough. The next day would come, and life would continue. We would face whatever came next, but we didn't have to have it all figured out just yet. For now, we were free from the pressure of needing to have all the answers. We could just be. And maybe that was the start of something real.